The Valley of Elah is a place of stark contrasts. On one hill, the armies of Israel, paralyzed by fear, and on the other, the host of the Philistines, brimming with confidence. Between them, a champion emerges, a figure of such impossible scale that he seems to rend the very fabric of the natural order. His name is Goliath of Gath, and for 40 days, Goliath's voice, a weapon in itself, thunders across the valley, a challenge not merely to a nation, but to God himself. I defy the armies of Israel this day, he roars, a blasphemy that hangs in the air unanswered. This confrontation, etched into history as the ultimate underdog story, is far more than a simple mismatch of strength and stature. It's a theological crisis. When the shepherd boy David arrives, he sees not a military problem, but a spiritual one, hearing a man defying the armies of the living God. The prevailing analysis suggests that Goliath was not merely an unusually tall Philistine soldier. A careful reading of the biblical text, illuminated by its historical and theological context, reveals him as a post-flood echo of an ancient and terrible corruption, a living representative of the Nephilim, the primeval offspring of fallen angels of Genesis 6. This battle, therefore, is not just a clash of armies. It is a microcosm of a cosmic war, a chapter in the long conflict between the order of God and the forces of chaos that have sought to corrupt his creation from the beginning. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, do that right now. To understand Goliath, we have to first return to the world before the flood, to a brief but profoundly cryptic passage in Genesis 6. The text reads, "When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." Each phrase here is weighted with significance. The term sons of God in the Hebrew, Benai Ha-Elohim, is used consistently in the Old Testament to refer to angelic beings, members of God's heavenly council. It appears in the opening chapters of Job, where the sons of God present themselves before the Lord, and again in Job 38, where they shout for joy at the creation of the world. The text contrasts these heavenly beings with the daughters of men, or more literally, daughters of Adam, establishing a clear demarcation between the celestial and the terrestrial. It's in this scene the Nephilim appear. The name itself, derived from the Hebrew root nephal, means to fall, giving them the title the Fallen Ones. The syntax of Genesis 6:4 is crucial. It states that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, a statement of their presence that precedes and is distinct from the unions that follow. This complicates a simple reading that they were merely the offspring of sons of God and human women. Rather, they seem to be a category of being associated with this dark period of history. The offspring of these unions are described as the Giborim, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. While Giborim can be translated neutrally as heroes or warriors, the immediate context of escalating wickedness that provokes the flood suggests a far more sinister meaning. These were not men renowned for virtue, but for power, violence, and tyranny, infamous figures who dominated the antediluvian world. And real quick, antediluvian is just a fancy word that refers to a time before the flood of Noah. The more you know. The narrative placement of this account is a deliberate theological statement. It's no accident that the verses immediately following this episode describe God's sorrow at the state of humanity. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Ancient interpreters correctly understood this juxtaposition as causal. The unnatural unions and the rise of the Giborim were not incidental to the world's corruption. They were a primary catalyst, an ultimate expression of the rebellion that necessitated the cleansing judgment of the flood. This establishes the Nephilim tradition as the epitome of antediluvian sin, a standard against which later corruptions would be measured. While the Bible is the final authority, it is essential to understand the world in which its words were first heard. Extra-biblical texts from the Second Temple period, while not inspired scripture, provide an invaluable window into how ancient Jews and early Christians interpreted the cryptic account in Genesis 6. They reveal a rich and detailed tradition that formed the backdrop of their understanding. The most detailed of these is the book of 1st Enoch. This text, quoted in the New Testament book of Jude, elaborates dramatically on the Genesis narrative. It tells of 200 angelic beings known as the Watchers, who, driven by lust, made a pact to descend from heaven and take human wives. But their sin was twofold. Beyond the forbidden unions, they also taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy for crafting weapons, sorcery, astrology, and the arts of seduction through cosmetics. This illicit tutelage unleashed violence, idolatry, and corruption upon the earth. The offspring of the Watchers and human women were the Nephilim, described as ferocious giants who consumed all of humanity's resources before turning on humans themselves, and finally, on each other in a cannibalistic frenzy, which I think we can all agree is kind of gross. Another text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Genesis Apocryphon, personalizes this cosmic crisis, recording a poignant and fearful domestic scene in which Lamech, the father of Noah, suspects his wife of infidelity with one of the Watchers. He is terrified that his newborn son Noah is not his own, but the seed of an angel. Batanash, Lamech's wife, must swear a solemn oath by the Great Holy One that the child is Lamech's, a scene that reveals how the threat of this angelic corruption was a tangible reality that invaded even the homes of the righteous. The Apocryphon also makes an explicit connection between the giants and the world's violence, mentioning the blood which the Nephilim shed as a reason for the coming judgment. Not all ancient traditions were so graphic, however. The Book of Jubilees, another text from roughly the same period, also affirms the Watchers descended and bore the Nephilim. However, it claims the angels' initial purpose was to instruct humanity in righteousness before succumbing to sin. However, the Enochian version, with its vivid depiction of rebellious angels and monstrous offspring, was by far the more dominant narrative, influencing numerous other texts and even New Testament writers like Peter and Jude. Not to mention the fact that it lines up a whole lot closer to what we find in the passages of Genesis and Numbers. We'll get to Numbers a little later. The narrative of Genesis 6 contains a phrase that creates a profound theological puzzle. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. This clause is the explicit biblical warrant for a post-flood manifestation of giants, yet it seems to stand in direct contradiction to the totality of the flood account, which states that every living thing on the face of the earth was blotted out, save for Noah and his family in the ark. If the flood was a perfect and complete judgment, how could any trace of this antediluvian corruption survive? To suggest it did is to imply that God's judgment was somehow incomplete. The Bible doesn't specify the mechanism of their reemergence, but two primary theories have been proposed to resolve this tension. The first is the second incursion theory, which suggests that a different group of fallen angels committed the same sin after the flood, resulting in a new, more geographically limited population of giants. This wouldn't contradict passages like Jude 6, which speaks of the first group of angels being bound in chains, since it doesn't preclude other angelic beings from rebelling at a later time. I'm not too fond of this line of thought, but it's possible. The second theory involves a genetic bottleneck, suggesting that the genetic code of the Nephilim was carried through the flood by one of Noah's daughters-in-law. Given the subsequent curse on Canaan and the fact that the Philistines come from Egypt, two of the sons of Ham, it is often speculated that Ham's wife may have carried this genetic material, which then manifested in some of the clans that later inhabited the lands Israel would later war against. At the end of the day, while Scripture remains silent on the precise method, it is unambiguous about the result. Nephilim, or something similar, were present in the Promised Land when Israel arrived. Before we move forward with this insane investigation of the ancient world, please take a moment and hit the like and subscribe button so the algorithm learns people actually care about the more epic parts of history. Thank you so much. Now, let's get back to the video. The challenge facing the Israelites upon their approach to Canaan was not merely against ordinary people. The land was occupied by several formidable clans renowned for their stature and strength, a lingering echo of the pre-flood world. The conquest, therefore, was not simply a territorial dispute. It was a divine mandate to cleanse the land of a deeply rooted, supernaturally tinged evil. The biblical record names several of these clans. The Rephaim are mentioned as early as Abraham's time in Genesis 14:5. Deuteronomy describes them as a people great and numerous and tall. The most famous of their remnant was Og, the king of Bashan, whose immense iron bedstead, over 13 feet long, was kept as a testament to his staggering size. The Anakim, descendants of Enoch, were perhaps the most feared, dwelling in the hill country, particularly around Hebron, and were known for their great strength. It's this group that the spies explicitly link to the Nephilim. The Amim and the Zamzumim, also called Zuzim, are described in Deuteronomy 2 as being as tall as the Anakim and were also considered part of the broader Rephaim category. These were simply the local names given to them by the Moabites and the Ammonites, respectively. These clans were not randomly scattered, but were concentrated in the very regions God had promised to Israel: Bashan, the territories of Moab and Ammon, and the strategic hill country of Canaan. This geographical focus transforms the nature of the conquest. It wasn't a land grab, but a holy war. Some scholars argue that the divine command for harem, or total destruction, was specifically directed at cities and locales known to be population centers for these giant clans. This provides a crucial theological rationale for the severity of the command given to Joshua, reframing the invasion as an act of cosmic justice against the lingering seed of an ancient rebellion. The most direct link between the post-flood giants and their antediluvian predecessors comes from the report of the 12 spies in Numbers 13:33. I told you we'd get there. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. This is the only place in Scripture that explicitly identifies a post-flood group with the Nephilim of Genesis 6. A primary objection to taking this statement at face value is that it was part of a bad report delivered by 10 faithless spies. Their language is clearly emotive and exaggerated. The comparison to grasshoppers is a classic example of hyperbole born of fear and a desire to dissuade the people from obeying God. However, to dismiss the entire report as fabrication is to miss the crucial distinction made in the text. The sin of the 10 spies was not that they lied about the existence of giants, but that they allowed the giant's size to eclipse God's power. Their fear didn't invent the Anakim, it merely distorted the perception of Israel's ability to overcome them. The two faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb, never contradicted the physical description of the land's inhabitants. They didn't say there are no giants there. Instead, they declared, "Do not fear the people of the land. The Lord is with us. Do not fear them." They affirm the reality of the threat, but declare the sufficiency of God's power. Furthermore, the later military campaigns of Joshua confirm the report's factual basis. Joshua 11:21 records that a key objective of the conquest was to cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab. This action would make no sense if the Anakim were merely a figment of the spies' fearful imagination. The hyperbole was in the comparison, grasshoppers, not in the identification of the enemy. The spies accurately identified the foe but failed to trust their God. The narrative of the conquest provides the final crucial link in the chain connecting the Nephilim of Genesis to the giant in the Valley of Elah. After Joshua's primary military campaign to secure the Promised Land, the text offers a status report on the giant clans. Joshua 11:21-22 is explicit, and at that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the hill country. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. This passage is of paramount importance. It establishes the Philistine city of Gath not merely as an enemy stronghold, but as one of the last three known sanctuaries for the Anakim, the very people directly identified as being from the Nephilim in the book of Numbers. The stage is now set. The lingering seed of the giants has been cornered, contained within a few coastal cities, waiting for the next chapter in the divine conflict. Centuries later, when Israel faces the Philistines in the Valley of Elah, a champion steps forward. 1 Samuel 17:4 introduces him simply as Goliath from Gath. His role as a champion identifies him as a Gibor, a mighty warrior, directly echoing the language used to describe the infamous offspring in Genesis 6:4. The narrative then lingers on his physical presence, emphasizing a scale that seems to defy ordinary human limits. He is clad in a bronze helmet and a coat of scale armor weighing 5,000 shekels, which is about 125 pounds. He has bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear is like a weaver's beam, and its iron point alone weighs 600 shekels, about 15 pounds. The text isn't merely stating that he is tall, it's painting a portrait of a being of superhuman strength and proportion, an enemy from a different order of existence. An objection to Goliath's connection with a race of supergiants, though I wouldn't call it particularly earth-shattering, centers on the textual evidence for his height. While the Masoretic text, the standard Hebrew Bible from which most modern English translations are derived, gives his height as 6 cubits and a span, which is approximately 9 feet 9 inches, this reading is challenged by older sources. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, along with a key manuscript of Samuel found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the writings of the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, all concur on a different figure, 4 cubits and a span. This would place Goliath's height at a more modest, though still formidable, 6 feet 9 inches. While the manuscript evidence for the shorter height is compelling and may well represent the original text, it doesn't invalidate the theological point. In the ancient Near East, where the average male stood closer to 5 foot 6 inches, a man who was nearly 7 feet tall and possessed proportional strength would have been a terrifying and seemingly invincible opponent. His stature would have been truly gigantic in this context. Indeed, extra-biblical sources from Egypt, such as the papyrus Anastasi, corroborate the presence of exceptionally tall warriors, known as the Shasu, in the region of Canaan during this period, lending historical plausibility to such figures. Ultimately, whether Goliath stood at 6'9" or 9'9", he perfectly fulfilled the narrative role of a superhuman adversary. The theological category he occupies as a representative of the giant clans of Gath is more significant than his precise measurement in inches. The story of David's conflict with the giants didn't end with Goliath's fall. The book of 2 Samuel records a series of later battles in which David's mighty men confronted and killed 4 more Philistine giants, all of whom hailed from Gath. This appendix to David's military history serves a critical theological purpose. These 4 giants, Ishbi-Benob, Saph, the brother of Goliath, and an unnamed man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, are all described as being descendants of Rapha. The name Rapha is the singular progenitor of the Raphaim, one of the primary designations for the giant clans that Israel had been battling since the days of Moses and Joshua. This explicitly connects Goliath and his kin to the broader ancient tradition of giants in Canaan. This account demonstrates that Goliath was not a genetic anomaly or a lone behemoth. He was part of a persistent, multi-generational lineage of giants centered in the stronghold of Gath. David's single combat in the Valley of Elah was the most famous encounter, but the work of eradicating this remnant had to be continued by his warriors. This reinforces the theme of the conquest as an ongoing holy war. The threat posed by this ancient bloodline was not eliminated in a single battle, but had to be decisively and systematically extinguished until the last of these champions had fallen. Despite the strong chain of textual evidence, two major theological objections are often raised against the identification of Goliath with the Nephilim tradition. The first is the Sethite interpretation of Genesis 6. This view, which gained prominence through the influential theologian Augustine of Hippo in the 5th century AD, argues that the sons of God were not angels at all, but the righteous male descendants of Adam's son Seth. The daughters of men in this reading were the ungodly female descendants of Cain. The sin, therefore, was not a supernatural transgression, but a spiritual one, the intermarriage of the godly line with the ungodly, leading to widespread apostasy. This interpretation, however, faces several critical flaws. Historically, it is a late development that runs contrary to the near-unanimous understanding of Second Temple Judaism and early church fathers, including Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Ambrose, who overwhelmingly affirmed the angelic view. Augustine's shift was based largely on philosophical objections to the idea that spiritual beings could physically procreate rather than on the plain reading of the text. Textually, the interpretation is incoherent. As previously noted, Benai ha-Elohim is a consistent term for angels, and the passage contrasts them with the daughters of Adam, mankind, not the daughters of Cain. Most importantly, the Sethite view lacks explanatory power. It cannot adequately account for the result, the Nephilim. It's difficult to see why the intermarriage of two human lines, however spiritually distinct, would produce a race of giants so infamous they were remembered for millennia, whereas the angelic view provides a direct and sufficient cause for this extraordinary effect. The second objection is simpler. The Bible never explicitly labels Goliath a Nephilim. This argument from silence, however, ignores the clear and deliberate associations woven by the biblical authors. The connection is not made by a single label, but by an unmistakable chain of identity. Goliath is from the city of Gath. Gath is explicitly named as one of the last three cities where the Anakim survived Joshua's conquest. The Anakim are explicitly identified as coming from the Nephilim. The biblical writers simply didn't need to use the archaic term Nephilim. By placing Goliath in this specific city, with this specific heritage, and linking his kin to the progenitor of the Rephaim, they painted him in Nephilim colors. For an ancient audience steeped in these narratives, the implication was undeniable. Goliath was the living embodiment of the Nephilim remnant, a champion of the ancient bloodline. Returning to the Valley of Elah, the full theological weight of the confrontation becomes clear. Goliath's challenge is not merely the boast of an arrogant soldier, it is the defiant roar of the primeval rebellion. He embodies the arrogance, power, and chaos of the Genesis 6 giants, a physical manifestation of an ancient evil that stands in opposition to God's divine order and his chosen people. David's response is framed in equally theological terms. He rejects the contest of human strength and reframes the battle on its proper spiritual ground. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This is the heart of the matter. The battle is not shepherd versus soldier, Israel versus Philistia, or even faith versus fear. It is a divine confrontation between God's anointed champion and the lingering shadow of the Nephilim. David's victory, achieved with a simple stone, is a decisive blow against the ancient corruption that once sought to overwhelm the earth. It's a triumph of God's order over primeval chaos, a powerful demonstration that no enemy, no matter how great in stature or renown, can stand against the will of the living God. In this historic victory, David not only saves a nation, but also provides a prophetic picture of the ultimate triumph of his greater son, the Messiah, who would one day crush the head of the ancient serpent. So, am I completely off in my interpretation? Does the Sethite view hold more water? Please sound off in the comments. And if you want to hear my thoughts on what happened to those angels in Genesis 6, click on the video that's popping up on your screen right now. Also, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you can stay up to date when more content drops. God bless you guys, and be excellent to each other.